The second the words left my mouth, I felt something shift in the room, and I knew there was no pulling them back. I was 24 that year, working as an apprentice electrician for a small contracting company outside Tulsa, splitting an apartment with two roommates I barely saw because I spent most of my evenings at my best friend's place instead. Caleb Whitfield and I had known each other since freshman year of high school, the kind of friendship that survives bad breakups, worse haircuts, and one disastrous attempt at starting a lawn care business that lasted exactly one summer. Caleb lived with his dad, Daniel Whitfield, in a single-story house with a wraparound porch on the quieter end of town. His parents had split when Caleb was 11, and his mom had moved 2 states away not long after, so it had been just the two of them for over a decade. Daniel worked as a contractor himself, ran his own small crew doing renovations, and somewhere along the way had become more of a fixture in my life than my own father. He'd taught me how to throw a spiral when I was 15 because my dad worked nights and never had the time. He'd shown up to my high school graduation and clapped louder than anyone else in the bleachers. He was the kind of man who fixed things, actual things, broken faucets and bad transmission, but also the kind of things that don't have a clear fix, like a teenage boy spiraling after his mom left. He never made a big deal out of any of it. He just showed up. By the time I was in my 20s, Daniel was somewhere in his late 40s, still built like he could carry a load of lumber up 2 flights of stairs without breaking a sweat, with this calm, steady way of talking that made you feel like whatever you were panicking about probably wasn't as bad as you thought. Women noticed him. I'd seen it happen at Caleb's birthday cookouts, at the hardware store, even at the grocery store the one time I tagged along with him to grab charcoal. He never seemed to notice it himself, or if he did, he never let on. One Thursday night in late September, Caleb and I were in the living room with the football game on, a couple of empty pizza boxes folded up on the coffee table, the kind of evening where nothing was happening, and that was exactly the point. Daniel had been out back working on a deck railing that had been bothering him for weeks, and he came in through the side door still in his work clothes, sawdust on his forearms, looking worn out in that satisfied way you only get from doing something with your hands all day. Caleb made some joke about how his dad needed a girlfriend to drag him away from his tools on a Friday night. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the beer. Maybe it was just one of those moments where your mouth moves faster than your judgment. But I laughed and said that if I were a woman, I'd take Daniel over half the guys my age in this city is easy. That he was probably in better shape than I was. That my last girlfriend's dad couldn't even change a tire, and Daniel could build her an entire house from scratch. It was supposed to be a joke, a dumb, throwaway compliment dressed up as humor. Caleb went quiet. Daniel, who'd been heading toward the kitchen, stopped in the doorway. He turned around slowly, looked at me for a second longer than felt comfortable, and there was something in his face I couldn't quite place.
Not offense.
Not amusement, either. Something more like he was actually considering what I'd said. Then he asked me, plain as anything, if I meant that. I laughed it off, said of course, just messing around. The usual backpedaling you do when you realize a joke landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Caleb laughed too, nervous. The kind of laugh that's really just relief that the moment's over. But Daniel didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly, said something about needing a shower, and walked off down the hall. The rest of that night was strange. Caleb and I kept watching the game, but the conversation had this odd flatness to it, like neither of us wanted to be the one to bring it back up. I told myself it was nothing. People said things like that all the time. It didn't mean anything, except I couldn't stop thinking about the way Daniel had looked at me, like the joke had cracked something open that he'd been keeping shut for a long time. I started coming around less after that, not because anything had actually happened, nothing had, but because every time I walked into that house, I felt this low hum of awkwardness I couldn't shake. Caleb noticed I was making excuses, and I felt bad about it, but I didn't know how to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. About 3 weeks later, I went by to return a drill I'd borrowed, figuring Caleb would be home from his shift at the warehouse. He wasn't. Daniel was out front repainting the mailbox post, this small, mindless task he probably didn't need to be doing but was doing anyway because that's who he was. I almost turned around and left the drill on the porch, but he saw me before I could. We ended up talking. About nothing at first. The cowboy's defense, a leak in his truck's radiator, whether the new taco place on Memorial was worth the wait, but somewhere in there the conversation shifted. The way conversations do when two people have been carefully avoiding the same subject and finally get tired of avoiding it. He told me he'd been divorced for 13 years and hadn't seriously dated anyone in almost as long. Said it wasn't because he didn't want to, just that between the business and raising Caleb on his own, there'd never been room for it, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped expecting there to be. He said it without any self-pity in his voice, just a kind of tired honesty. Ice listened in a way I hadn't really listened to him before. I'd always seen Daniel as Caleb's dad, the guy who showed up, the steady hand. I'd never once thought about what his life actually looked like when nobody was around to see it. The quiet house after Caleb left for work, the dinners eaten alone, the years that had just kept moving without him. Over the next month or so, I found myself stopping by more, even when Caleb wasn't home. We'd talk on the porch, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Daniel never brought up what I'd said that night, and neither did I, but it sat between us anyway, quiet and unresolved, like a question neither of us was ready to ask out loud. Then one evening in late October, he finally said something that knocked the wind out of me. We were sitting on the porch steps, the air cooling fast the way it does once the sun drops in Oklahoma in the fall, and he said that he'd thought a lot about what I'd said that night, more than he probably should have. He said most people his age get used to being invisible, especially men who spend their whole lives taking care of someone else's needs before their own. He said it had been a long time since anyone made him feel seen, joke or not. Then he looked at me and asked if I'd been serious. I didn't answer right away. I sat there with my heart pounding, thinking about Caleb, about everything that friendship meant to me, about how insane this whole situation was. But I also thought about how, somewhere over the past month, I'd started looking forward to those porch conversations more than I wanted to admit. I told him I didn't know what I felt, but I knew I hadn't been lying that night on the couch. He nodded, didn't push it further, just said I should figure that out before either of us said anything else. Then he stood up, said he had an early job in the morning, and went inside. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had, trying to figure out where the line was between respect and something more, and whether I'd already crossed it without meaning to. A week later, I told Caleb. I asked him to meet me at the diner near the warehouse, somewhere neutral, because I didn't want to do this in his house, not after everything. I told him I had feelings for his dad. Not a joke this time, not something to laugh off. I told him I respected him too much to let it sit there unsaid, even if it cost us the friendship. Caleb's face went through about 5 different expressions before he settled on furious. He says I'd lost my mind. He said his dad was 23 years older than me, that this wasn't a joke anymore, that I'd turned something stupid into something that could blow up his whole family. He got up and left before I even finished my coffee. For the next 4 months, Caleb didn't speak to me. Not a text, not a call, nothing. I went from seeing him almost every day to not seeing him at all, and it was one of the loneliest stretches of my life. I started questioning everything. Whether what I felt for Daniel was even real, or whether I'd just gotten caught up in some strange, lonely confusion that wasn't worth losing my best friend over. Daniel and I barely talked either during that time. He told me once on the phone that he didn't want to be the reason his son stopped trusting either of us, and that he'd rather lose whatever this was than lose Caleb's respect. But something started changing on Caleb's end that I didn't find out about until much later. He told me eventually that he'd started noticing things about his dad he'd never paid attention to before. How Daniel would sit alone on the porch some nights, long after Caleb had gone to bed, how he'd stopped going out with his buddies from the crew as much. How tired he looked in a way that wasn't just physical. Caleb said it hit him one night, that his dad had spent 13 years putting everyone else first, and that maybe it wasn't fair for Caleb to be the one standing in the way of him finally getting something for himself. In March, Caleb called me out of nowhere. His voice was calmer than I expected, almost careful. He said if I ever hurt his dad, he'd never forgive me for it. But he said if I actually cared about him, the way it seemed like I did, then maybe he needed to stop acting like this was something shameful and start treating it like what it actually was. 2 months after that, Daniel and I went on our first real date. Nothing fancy, a steakhouse off Route 66 that he'd been going to since before I was born, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a waitress who called everybody Han. We talked for almost 3 hours, about things neither of us had ever said out loud to anyone else. It felt less like the beginning of something new and more like something that had been waiting a long time to happen. It's been almost 4 years now. Caleb and I are still close Closer, honestly, than we were before any of this happened, because we got through something most friendships never have to survive. The first year was rough. There were holidays that felt unbearably tense, relatives who didn't know what to say, a few people in town who stopped speaking to Daniel altogether once word got around. But none of that mattered as much as we thought it would in the moment. People eventually stopped caring, and the ones who didn't weren't people we needed in our lives anyway. Daniel and I got married last spring in his backyard, under the same oak tree he used to grill burgers beneath every 4th of July. Caleb stood up as best man. He gave a toast that started as a joke about how this was the strangest wedding speech he'd ever have to give, and ended with him saying that watching his dad laugh again, really laugh, for the first time in years, made every uncomfortable conversation worth it. Some nights, the three of us still sit out on that porch, the same one where Daniel asked me if I'd meant what I said, and Caleb brings it up like it's the funniest story in the world now. The night his best friend accidentally proposed to his dad over a football game and a couple of cold pizzas. We laugh about it every time, but underneath the joke, I think all three of us know it wasn't really an accident at all. It was just the first time any of us said something true out loud, even if none of us meant to.